Gary, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Now, it's been a while since I've focused on someone's undergraduate degree to kick off the show, but I think you have an interesting one that's worth bringing up. You studied psychology, and security over the last handful of years has more and more kind of focused on the human elements as we talk about phishing and understanding where people can potentially fall prey to some of these different attackers' tactics. So just to kick off this whole conversation, I want to hear your thoughts on how psychology maybe influenced your initiation into security and how it's influenced your perspective since.
Well, it's a great question. Most of it revolves around social engineering, and social engineering ultimately was what drives security threats. So yes, there are brute force attacks where a hacker develops code and that uses that code to break into a system, a platform, or device. But at some point, brute force can be regulated, and you can actually block most of these attacks at some point in the near future. And so attackers are now using social engineering to get through, like figuring out your password by giving you a false email or pretending there's someone else, like a family member. And so those are difficult to track and difficult to identify, difficult to block. And so education becomes really important, educating consumers and business people alike, anyone connected to the internet, about understanding that whether or not they're confronted with a threat or a friendly email, a friendly communication, friendly text message, or they should be not responsive to it, etc. And so that requires social engineering, and that's what interests me, and requires a certain level of understanding of technology and also human behavior. So it kind of plays in hand with what I've studied in the past.
Right. And I feel like from a layperson's perspective, psychology sometimes feels to me as a field of almost like one-liners, like fun facts that you can bring up from time to time throughout your just experience professionally, whether it's like this Stanford prison experiment or Pavlov's dogs or like the Dunning-Kruger effect. So I'm curious, is there any one like study or citation that you commonly find yourself bringing up in a security context that helps illustrate some of these different points that we're talking about?
You know what? I can't think of anything off the top of my head right now.
Yeah.
It's such a wide spectrum of sort of issues that we're confronted with, and it's at so many different levels that I could summarize them in any particular way. So no, the answer is no.
Yeah, totally fair. Like you said, it touches a whole range, and I'm sure has also just been ingrained in your thinking after this much time in the field. So let's go to the start of your cyber experience then, or at least what seems to me as the start of it, which was founding, I think it was CyberDefender back in 2003. How did that actually come about? What inspired this transition and segue into the security market?
Yeah, it's a good question. So when I first started the company in 2003, 2004, we first started as a platform that would block spam, and we developed a platform where companies that do email marketing would be participating in this sort of unified environment where they we would collect emails of people who don't want to be emailed, and then share that information with companies that conduct email marketing business. And so it was more like a do not email list. Like we have a do not call list, we create a do not email list.
Right.
And so we tried to turn that into a business. It unfortunately did not work out because nobody wanted to pay us to manage a do not email list. Maybe it was counterintuitive to a certain extent. But we decided to build software for consumers, decided to start competing with the traditional anti-malware companies and build an application, started selling it, had some success. We figured out how to market services and software together in combination. So services like support, identity protection, and then we started selling it in bundles. And so that took off and became pretty big, took the company to NASDAQ, went from 0 to $100 million in revenue in a relatively short amount of time. And so that's how it started off. And since then, I've been involved in different companies, including a company called Anchor Free, called Pango now. It's the biggest VPN company in the world with 650 million users. We grew pretty fast, Silicon Valley company, backed by Goldman Sachs. And then most recently, I founded RealDefense, which is a holding company that does acquisitions in this space, consumer privacy and security companies. And we'll also had a good run. We've done 4 acquisitions and have been growing sequentially year over year, month over month, quarter to quarter. And so, yeah, that's the background there.
Yeah, that's perfect. And you're already transitioning into where I want to spend the bulk of this conversation, which is talking about RealDefense, your kind of strategy and philosophy there, because I think this kind of acquisition model within cyber is very fascinating. But before we get there, one of the things that I was just reflecting on as you were speaking is this idea of a security company that's grown to $100 million in revenue, with all the different unicorns in security that exist today that haven't gotten anywhere close to $100 million in revenue. It's a big statement as far as what you're able to accomplish, and also just a testament maybe to how much emphasis there is on these high growth products that could potentially take over the world from a security standpoint, with so many other healthy security businesses that exist out there. And I think that also segues us back into RealDefense. So you gave the quick teaser, and I'll let you elaborate on anything that I kind of miss here. But the way I think about it, and like you alluded to, is essentially a holding company that acquires a series of different cybersecurity solutions that are aimed at more kind of small businesses. So these aren't going to be your traditional venture-backed, high growth, billion-dollar aspiration companies, but more of, hey, what does that kind of middle market or lower cap company need from a security standpoint, without the kind of price tag or all of the setup, logistics, maintenance that's required with a full security team? And how can you bundle these products together to have kind of a single solution for these small businesses, where you can streamline some of that operations, that finance, that sales, that marketing across the whole portfolio? Is that basically the idea? Is there any kind of core element of this business model that I'm missing?
No, you generally got it right. I mean, we're focused on consumer products, so we're not enterprise facing, not SMB facing. It's all consumer product. Our revenue is derived from licensing our technology as well as selling directly to consumers. We cover probably most of the world in terms of user base. Through our licensing partners, we have tens of millions of subscribers. Directly, we have over 1 million, and we target mostly consumers in North America, and through our partners, it's worldwide. And so the emphasis we have is more in privacy versus traditional security, which is antivirus and anti-malware. We found that to be the biggest gap in the consumer security and privacy space. There's not a lot of leadership, innovation. We think we're one of the innovators, and have products that are in line with what consumers expect. We're also seeing privacy being the biggest concern, meaning that consumers don't know where the data is. They don't know who's using it. They're not being paid for it when someone is using it. They are bombarded with advertising that they may or may not want. And so there's an opportunity here. We're not trying to be a anti-business or prevent advertising from existing. We use advertising to market our products. We certainly don't want advertising to go away, but we want to give consumers a certain amount of control. And I think by giving them more control, they're going to benefit. They're going to create a benefit for themselves, which means that they'll see ads and products and offers that they care about, and it gives advertisers more granularity in terms of targeting, which is ultimately what advertising is all about, is get to the right consumer. So it's a complicated space. There are a lot of gaps. There's lack of legal oversight. There's no technical framework. There's no compliance infrastructure. If you build a car and you want to sell it in the United States or any country for that matter, you can't just do it, right? You can just build a car and start selling it. The bumpers have to be certain standards. You have to have seat belts and you have to have airbags. Well, that's not a requirement. That's not a requirement for any the software application, mobile app, website. You can just go online and start selling and do whatever you want, as long as it's not illegal. So it's unfortunate that exists today, but it's nothing that we as a small company can do about. We can't influence the law necessarily, but we can influence consumers. So that's why we chose this path.
Yeah. So, I mean, walk me through that a little bit further though, right? Because a lot of people, I think, would agree with this problem that you're describing. Privacy has certainly become much more on the forefront of consumer concerns. I mean, we've seen Apple obviously prioritize privacy as one of their kind of core marketing campaign ideals. But I think a lot of people, if they had this same idea that we're talking about here, recognizing this problem, they might say, okay, how do I go out and build a startup that addresses this issue? But you took a different approach. You said, hey, let's build a holding company. Let's leverage some of the great products that exist out there today and bring them all together. So what made you opt for that kind of strategy as opposed to the more traditional venture-backed approach?
Well, first of all, we're big believers in profit. And so we
Yeah,
like companies that are already profitable. We're not venture capitalists. We don't pay high multiples for companies we acquire. In fact, we
right.
prefer companies that are not growing as fast or maybe even declining. In fact, every company we bought in our portfolio for RealDefense was declining prior to our acquisition. And
Interesting.
now, since our acquisition, they're all growing. Every single one of the assets we bought is growing. And
Wow.
it's very profitable and very healthy. But that's a managerial, tactical sort of advantage that we have. We have a lot of experience. My management team has had 20 to 30 years of individual experience in the space. So we're not new to this. We're not trying new things. We're pretty much sort of kind of like steady hand on
Sure.
best practices, and we know how to do it. We're also operational experts. We look at sales infrastructure just as equally important as building good code. And we're experts in call center management and call center sales. We know how to optimize billing, improve lifetime value, churn reduction, and all those important business things that you have to do in order to stay profitable and grow your business. It's really interesting to see how a lot of venture capital backed companies don't understand these basic things.
Sure.
And it's lack of experience. You can't blame someone who's never run a business before to understand these complex areas of the company that they're running. And sometimes they fail, sometimes they need new management. And so that's where we come in. We're good at it. We're have had good success, and that's the paradigm behind RealDefense. We're
Right.
operational experts, and we like undervalued assets.
And it sounds like there's a lot of parallels with private equity companies, right? Where you say, hey, this company's growth has kind of slowed down. We see an opportunity where if we're able to streamline the management of this company, bring in some more expertise, bring in our just management experience, then we can streamline and get it to a healthy growth rate and then go ahead and sell it in the future, right? But when I hear RealDefense, it sounds like you're less focused on reselling the companies in the future and more having them continue to be a part of the ecosystem that you're building. Is that right? And if
Yeah,
so, how is that
yeah,
actually influenced?
we're not. Yeah, to answer your question, or
Yeah,
to reiterate what you said, we're not building to sell. We're building to sustain and grow. We're looking to continue these businesses into as long as we can continue them. And
right,
the demand is there. I don't see a future where consumers are not going to use PCs or tablets or
right.
phones. Even if we go into virtual environments with metaspheres and meta universes out there, it's not going to change the fact that you still need a device to connect to these environments, and you still need some form of security. And so I think cybersecurity is always going to be sort of a permanent component for the next 100 years of our digital experience, and so digital life. In terms of our playbook, we are not designed in terms of how we structure the business to have an exit event or liquidity event.
Right.
We're looking to just continue to grow, bolt on more acquisitions, stay profitable, and become as big as we possibly can become. And that's it. If we
Right.
never sell, never go public, it's perfectly fine.
Sure. And so, I mean, continuing this line of thought then, right? You're maybe competing with private equity companies who are interested in buying up some of these security companies that have slowed down their growth rate, still great acquisition targets, but you're pitching something very different. And so how has that actually influenced your success with the founders of these original businesses to ensure that they choose you as the one who's going to continue that brand, continue to grow it for the long term, as opposed to these PE companies, which have a more kind of clear short-term motive, or at least shorter term?
Sure. So, a traditional private equity firm will not be interested in selling, running the business that they're buying. They'll
Right.
expect the management team to keep doing what they're doing. And they also focus on certain market value of businesses. So for instance, a company who's doing 2 or 3 million, $4 million in EBITDA is not a candidate for most private equity firms. It's too small.
Right.
And so unless you have an independent sponsor or somebody who's just an individual who wants to get into a business like that, of that size, they might be an interested buyer. But generally speaking, private equity wants to see companies of substantial size, 20 million, $30 million in EBITDA plus, or companies, if they're losing money, doing 50 to 100 million in revenue, that allows them to offset their risk if there is
Right.
a collapse. And so, so most of these small businesses don't qualify for private equity. We like those businesses because we're bolting them on into something that's already working. And so
Right.
we're not running them as independent companies. They're going to be part of RealDefense business model. So for us, it's interesting to talk to a company doing $1 million in EBITDA. There's two managers in the company, and they're very profitable, but they're maybe flat or declining because
Sure.
they don't have working capital, they don't have advertising expertise or sales infrastructure. Those are all very common problems in small businesses. Those are our target companies. We
Yeah.
also look for divestitures. If you're a larger company, you've got a small company in your portfolio that you don't want to manage anymore, or it's taken on too much of your time, we come in, we make an offer. We have a lot of those relationships right now. We're acquiring constantly, and we take that company off their hand. We pay them a good value for the business, and our transactions are very simple. We pay at closing. We don't have any complex stock deals, or we're not public. We're not offering them some crazy derivative security.
Right.
We keep it really simple, and sellers like that. And we don't fire anyone. We keep all the people on staff. We try to pay them more money if we can. We're a good acquirer. You want us to buy your company if you're selling. But it's also very narrow. Our spectrum is narrow. Think about how many small privacy and security companies are there out there, right? There's not a lot. And so if they exist, we're talking to them, and
Sure.
some of them don't want to sell because they have a good business and profitable, and they can continue doing it for the years to come, so they don't want to sell necessarily. So to answer your question in a long format here, we are not a traditional private equity. We're looking to flip out of our acquisitions. So we're looking to stick
Right.
around and keep them.
Right. And how do you see this kind of conglomerate coming together, right? Where, again, you're not trying to sell these companies, you're talking about the kind of longest term, you're talking about the future of privacy, and how even if we go to the metaverse, that's still going to be something that's very relevant. How do you kind of continue to strategize in a way where you know that there's going to be new startups who emerge onto the scene and have this venture-backed growth and are going to receive that support to build like the next privacy behemoth for direct-to-consumer security?
So, like any other business, there's always a risk of someone coming in and doing something better than you.
Yeah.
Every company's at risk. I don't care if you're Elon Musk, Google, whatever. There's always a risk of someone coming in and eating your lunch for you. But the practical reality is that in consumer privacy and security space, you have to have channels, you have to have marketing capability, you have to have scale when it comes to supporting large volume customers. We have that. We're in 20,000 retail stores. We have substantial partnerships with every larger security company in the world and every large device manufacturer in the world. Those relationships take time to build. You can't just walk into them and say, "Hey, here's my product. Why don't you sell it?" And so, we're excited about that strength that we have, and we don't think that there's necessarily a threat. In fact, we welcome new opportunities. There's a lack of product in the space. Like, if you think about how many products are there that actually protect your privacy, How many search engines are there that protect your privacy? I can think
Sure.
of maybe one or two. So it's not an area where there's lots of competition. Now, on the enterprise security side, there's lots of competition. A lot
Yeah.
of companies doing enterprise security. But on the consumer side, much, much less. And so there's also confusion about with the free product and paid product, and consumers are constantly thinking like, I'm getting something for free, it must be adequate. And in most cases, it's not. And so there's that challenge. That's a bigger challenge, to be honest, than a competitive challenge. It's just the free stuff. It's something that hurts everyone at the end.
Right. And let's talk about this kind of longer term vision you have as far as what consumer privacy might look like, and this idea around advertising you threw out, because this is something that I
Yeah.
find fascinating and find myself talking about all the time. And I think we're already starting to see it develop, right? Where Apple has given you this additional power over your data, and companies are starting to say, hey, with your advertising, you can make those preferences for yourself. Maybe some people want those more targeted ads because they find things that are actually useful to them. But I think the majority of people are still saying, well, if I don't have to share this additional level of data, why would I? And the parallel that I like to end up drawing as well is with Netflix. We've seen this new option where, hey, you can go ahead and spend your time and watch our ads, or you have to buy our more premium version, which costs extra. So it's giving the
Right.
consumer the decision on where do you really value. Is it the privacy piece and just no advertising as a whole? Or is it, again, just choosing between those different models? And so as I think about the future of privacy, I think, well, what if there's the option, it's ask app not to track, but then you have to pay the premium version of that app, which is an extra $2 a month, let's say. And how does that change
Right.
consumers' behavior on the decision? And where are consumers ultimately going to value their data? So I'm curious your perspective on this whole topic and how that fits into the real defense strategy.
Yeah, it's a good question. So again, to my earlier point, there's no oversight in this space. There's no,
Right.
there are some laws that exist, and they're different from state to state. There's some federal statutes out there, but none of them are specific enough to deal with the real sort of challenges that consumers face. The fact that Apple has created these barriers to entry for advertisers, it doesn't necessarily mean that consumers are better off. You still have a company, which is Apple, that knows, that has that data. So
Yeah, for
nothing's
sure.
changed except they're keeping the data and they're not selling it to third parties. But they are themselves are an institution, a commercial institution who controls that information. So consumers have not gained necessarily anything here. So there should be some oversight. There should be some laws that say the data needs to reside with a third party, that the collection of the data needs to be explicit, meaning that it's not some, those terms of service and privacy policies that you agree to when you, who reads that stuff? Like, are you going to sit there and go through 20 pages of information and decipher what's right is what's wrong and what's actually happening? There's no way in the world you're going to do that. And so
Right.
that's not explicit communication. Explicit communication is like, do you agree that we're going to collect your data and sell it to everyone that asks? Yes, I agree, or no, I don't agree. That's explicit. So I think there needs to be some basic sort of best practices in how information is explicitly delivered to consumers and how they actually agree to it. But more importantly is how that information is used. So there is no communication to consumers that says, so we're Google, we just collected a bunch of traffic data from you. We know which sites you went to, and we sold it to Bank of America. Bank of America then decided to send you an email message that says, hey, it looks like you're interested in a credit card. Here's a credit card offer. There's nothing wrong with that. That practice has existed before internet was even born. There was data brokers, and data brokerage is not some new concept that was created from the internet, right? So the problem with all this is that how that information is, again, delivered to consumers. They're not explicitly told about it. That information is sitting through it's filtered through some third party. You don't even know who. They append it to other databases, not asking you permission, et cetera, et cetera. Now we're even at a different phase of this, which is fingerprinting. Fingerprinting means that your digital footprint is recorded. A digital footprint has nothing to do with your identity. It doesn't know your name. It doesn't care about your, height, weight, or any of your personal information characteristics. It cares about your behavior, and that's the dangerous part, because that
Hmm.
cannot be changed. It's irreversible. So once you're fingerprinted and you have certain patterns online, you could always be found, no matter where you are on the internet. And so if you're a bad guy and the government wants to track you down, God bless it. Keep going after those people and do your job, right? But if most people are not committing crimes when they connect to the internet, 99.9% of people don't do bad things when they go
At
online.
least.
And so, right, at least that amount. So those people need to have some protections against this type of data collection. And they need to give explicit permission. They need to moderate it on their own terms, meaning turn off, turn on, and more importantly, maybe even compensate it for the data sharing. And so if we can come to some balance there, where there's explicit data collection, you're made aware when data is shared, some data is not shared, some data is left with third parties, and then maybe there's a way for you to get compensated for sharing. I think everyone's going to win. Advertisers are going to win. Cybersecurity companies are going to be more relevant, more important in this equation. Platform companies like Apple, Google will get better data, cleaner data, less lawsuits that they're involved in constantly around this topic. And their partners and advertisers are going to get clean data and no gray sort of ambiguity when it comes to compliance. Right now, that's how it is. Like you could be doing business and one day you get sued. You just don't know what you did wrong, and because the laws are not very clear. So it's a complicated area. In fact, I would say it's more complicated than cybersecurity, on a standalone basis, because that's just brute force attacks. This other stuff we're talking about, it's not a cybersecurity issue. It's not an attack. It's a data problem, right? You're collecting information, not necessarily with permission, and then you're selling it. Well, that's a lot bigger than cybersecurity threats in terms of volume of transactions. Think about that. Like all the data that's collected and it's used for marketing purposes. Think of the volume of e-commerce that creates. It's in trillions of dollars. It's not billions of dollars.
Yeah.
So, right, and your mobile devices, your computers are all making that work. It's all part of the equation.
And I would argue, I don't want to take the conversation fully down this direction, but I mean, obviously data does have ramifications from a cybersecurity lens as well, right? All that data that you're collecting for privacy cases. But the part that I do want to go back to is you mentioned this idea of 99.9%, and we mentioned or more of users on the internet are legitimate. But if you think about like TSA, for example, right? 99.9+% of passengers going through TSA are also just legitimate users who want to fly on a plane. And so I'm curious, as you think about these different tools that you're building for consumer privacy, we've seen tools that have been built for legitimate defense in cybersecurity, like pen testing tools that you can use to scan your own web application. We've seen those very quickly be turned around and used by attackers. And so my question for you is, as you're building these new privacy tools that enable users to have this greater level of kind of shroud around them and perform activities without the same level of oversight, how do you address the case where there is this very small percentage of users that might be able to use that for evil?
Well, that's, you can have a knife at home that can be used to cut a piece of bread, or can be used to kill a person, right? That's not changed. A phone can be used to commit a cyber crime, or a phone can be used to make a phone call. Like the tools of the trade are changing. I think we have to just the industry has to adapt to these changes and create barriers to entry for bad actors. If you're in the military sector and you sell cybersecurity solutions, the government has to approve the sale of those tools to any country, right? And so, and rightfully so, but that necessarily does not exist in cybersecurity space. Like you mentioned, pen testing. If I'm a bad actor and I have a company and I go to a company who sells pen testing tools and buy the application, buy the service, they're not going to ask me necessarily what my background is and if I'm a bad person, if what my intentions are, right? They're just going to sell me the tool. So there's no verification of identity or background checks when it comes to selling these types of products. It's unfortunate, but that again comes down to, how much legal compliance do we want to bring into this industry, and there isn't any. So I think when it comes to cybersecurity, there should be a whole framework of laws that regulate how these tools are sold, who uses them, how they're used, some government oversight, compliance, just like there is in financial services. If you started a stock brokerage firm, you can just start one up and start selling stocks, right? Like that doesn't happen. Or if you wanted to have a bank, if you start a bank, you have to have the government give you the charter, permission, licenses, and you got to pay compliance officers and all these things you got to do. We don't have any of that in cybersecurity. It doesn't exist. And so we're part of a company that we license the technology. It's called Team, and they basically certify applications. They look at your code, they look at your business practices, and tell you if you're making mistakes or you're not following the rules. And they give you a stamp of approval, or they tell you need to fix certain areas of your product to be compliant. Why isn't that required for every app that's uploaded to the app stores? Right? Wouldn't it be great that Apple says, before you upload your app to the App Store, you have to go get certified by a third party that says your application doesn't have any malware, that your data collection practices are compliant with state and local laws, federal laws, that your business practices are legitimate, you're not overcharging, you're not doing some weird things with the data. That is a should be like a requirement. If you wanted to go to a pharmacy and sell a drug, well, how could you you can just do that, right? You can just get up in the morning and say, I have this new drug I created, I'm going to sell it through a pharmacy, right? Like you have to get FDA approval and that some other compliance you have to go through. So anyway, there are a lot of gaps in the space. There's a lot of unknowns, a lot of ambiguity.
Right.
It's wide open for opportunity.
Yeah, and I think you bring up some very great analogies, like very pointed in the sense of stockbrokers and pharmacy, like areas you clearly do not want to accept the other side of that kind of double-edged sword that we're talking about here, right? I think as you're talking, my concern when I think about, if every application had to have a third-party certification, I mean, who knows how much that's going to ultimately end up costing, and what great app ideas are no longer possible as a result, because now all of a sudden folks can afford to pay for that. Or like financial services, that same example, right? There's probably a lot more room for innovation with stockbrokers that have been doing largely the same thing for the last 40 years, with some slight adjustments that Robinhood, for example, has been able to have some great innovation in that space with like commission-free trading, fractional shares, et cetera. But my point is, innovation is certainly stifled when you have all that bureaucracy. So there is this kind of double-edged sword that comes along with it. And it'll be interesting to see how the security industry as a whole continues to kind of teeter between those two decisions of, do we opt for more standardization, more regulation, and just ensuring that everyone who is doing it perfectly right? Or do we take more the other side of, hey, there might be some kind of things that slip through the crack, and we don't want this product on the market, but by and large, the extra innovation that we're going to get by having this more laissez-faire model is going to outweigh those negative consequences, right? And so again, it'll just be kind of interesting to follow along as the space evolves. But my last question for you here, and our ceremonial last question on Secure Ventures, is, are you looking for investment or hiring? But you don't have that same investment model. You've already said that you're always acquiring, and that you also know every small business in the cybersecurity space, which I love that. But anything else you want to add, like folks on the team that you're maybe like positions that you're looking to fill with some new folks who are interested in the space?
Sure. So yeah, we're always acquiring. We're not looking for capital.
Right.
We are hiring engineers all the time. We're hiring product managers, marketing folks, director, VP level, looking for business development people, particularly in Europe, in Asia. So very interested to hear from folks who know how to sell consumer software in these areas. And looking for more acquisitions. If there's a company out there that wants to be sold and they're doing, anywhere between $1 million to $100 million in revenue, and profitable or even losing money, we'll look at those as well. We're happy to talk to them and see if we can get a deal done. We're very fast. We can move quickly, like I said, and we'll don't do complex transactions. We try to do cash at closing almost in all of our deals. I'll tell you one thing about just really quick about the internet cybersecurity space. The biggest thing, Elon Musk brought this up with Twitter recently in his litigation with them, is that a lot of internet companies don't know who their customers are. Like, for instance, like Facebook and Snap, all these guys, there are a lot of bots there, but there's no way for them to know who they are. And so one of the challenges about not certifying applications or not verifying the code is because you're giving bots an opportunity to operate on that device. And so if you create holes in your application or not cover those holes in your application, you're basically letting anyone control that application remotely. And so the fact that we have no authentication mechanism on the internet, when someone logs onto the internet, they're not authenticated as a human being. There is a way to do so. There are technologies that do this, but there is no best practices. There are no best practices in technology right now that require authentication of you being a human being. And so how can a company like Twitter, for instance, reasonably say that their users are humans? They can't. That's why they won't get into that debate with Musk, because they'll lose it. And so that has to do with market caps and all those things. But the fundamental problem with cybersecurity is that there's no authentication of anyone connected to the internet. So think about that. That's a big deal, and it's a fundamental flaw in the way that the internet's designed. And so cybersecurity is a big business because of that. And so if we eliminate that from the spectrum of security gaps, we'll have a lot of problems solved. But that ship has it's come and gone. It's gone. And so we're now dealing with all these devices that you don't know who's controlling them. You don't know if they're human, a human behind them, a robot, and that's going to be the problem to deal with, because the bots are there. They've been sitting on these devices, and they're manipulating information, news, content, traffic, trends, behaviors. All those are influenced through robots, and you're never going to know the true meaning of the data. You're not going to know what's really going on.
Right. It's an interesting thought to think that like every, I don't know, hour in an internet session, you had to like verify your fingerprint in order to continue making like HTTP requests, right? Obviously, there's all sorts of flaws with that simple of a model, but it is just an interesting concept as far as what that might look like.
Right. There's no easy answer, but I think we have to recognize that reality and say, there's 20% of internet users are fake. And it's probably the case with Facebook. It's probably the case with Snap and all these platforms. And of course, it sounds bad, and it sounds terrifying to say that some of the traffic you have in a network and propagation of content is driven by robots and not by humans. And so, but that's the reality we live in. And I think we need to accept that reality and also build tools from either marketing side, if you're a marketer, if you're a data gatherer, to identify the source of the data and understand whether or not that data comes from a human or a robot. And that is a complicated space. And so that's not the space we're in, but that I think for companies out there who want to innovate, this is one area to get involved in.
And certainly at the top of everyone's minds with the Elon progression on that whole deal, like you alluded to. So great place to leave off, Gary. Thank you so much for the time. Again, I think it's very fascinating for a lot of folks to hear about this kind of different element of security that we talk about less in the startup ecosystem as a whole, which are these kind of profitable direct-to-consumer models that can then come together and provide all sorts of value today as opposed to 5 years from now. So thank you again for the time.
Great. Thanks for having me.